Okay, I'll tell you what. Let's just go ahead and get started, and then let's, people are free to come in as they will. Welcome to the session, Economic Policy from Past to the Future, and I'm Nik-Khah, pleased to serve as your chair for this session. We've got three contributions in this session, and what we plan to do is take the questions after each one. So we'll go about 20 minutes for the presentations, and then 10 minutes for questions, and we'll go one after the other. And first up, we have Patrick Fontaine, who's a professor at the Federal University of FMS. And he's going to be discussing with us inflation and underdevelopment, ideas from the creation of ECLAC. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Edward. I intend to be very brief. The article was already published, so there's no need to go through it in detail. So I'll just highlight the main aspects of it. Well, what is the goal of the article? It's to analyze three of previous articles that are considered the trilogy that founds the structuralist theory. Those articles are the Latin American Manifesto, the Economic Study of Latin America from 1949, and Theoretical and Practical Problems of Economic Growth. But I look through those articles trying to search for interpretation of inflation behaves in the periphery. So I look to them with a name on the word inflation. And in the manifesto, in there, besides the framework, but we can reach some conclusions by looking to it. And, the most basic one is if you have a combination of both inconvertible terms of trade deterioration, you should have inflationary pressure that arrives to the periphery through the rise of import prices. And this is an idea that appears later on Loyola Vasquez and Sunkel, that are the co-authors of the structuralist theory of inflation. So the larger framework gives already a perception of how inflation tends to behave in the periphery when analyzed through the lenses of the center-periphery relation. And as a consequence of that, gold standard is not feasible in the periphery. If you have a currency that is forced to devalue recurrently, it would be very difficult to maintain a gold standard in those regions. So we could say that Prebisch refuses the interpretation that inflation is caused by fiscal disorder. There are other reasons that cause inflation in the periphery. And he goes further. He says at that time it was considered the main cause of inflation. He believes it's not a direct cause of inflation, even though it might cause inflation indirectly, depending on how this issuing reaches the real economy. So if this issuing provokes a reason imports, it could cause inflation. So he's not completely in disagreement with the orthodox paradigm about money issuing, but he has a particular understanding of it. It might cause inflation, but not necessarily. And then we reach to the second article, and this article focuses the development of underdeveloped structures. So we are talking about the growth of the periphery and the development of the periphery. And he discusses particularly the incorporation of technology on the production in the periphery. It sounds something really good for the periphery, something that should happen to the periphery, but he stresses one important aspect of it, which is the fact that the incorporation of technology generates wealth, and by generating wealth, it also generates imports in countries that are largely dependent on imports. So it could also cause pressures on external balance and force the deterioration of terms of trade. But it also, and this is more important, it also saves labor by introducing capital-intensive technologies, which is something not desired in underdeveloped structures, as labor is largely available and more available than capital. So this is an undesired consequence of the incorporation of technology in the periphery. And it causes reductions on wages. So you have a smaller internal market of consumption. And it could also reduce the export prices as commodities uniform and compete by price, and you have a smaller cost of production because of the introduction of technology. So it could actually cause the reduction of export prices and then again force the deterioration of terms of trade. So he says that the imbalance on the balance of payments is persistent, is a natural result of the progress of underdeveloped economies. And they will manifest those external restrictions or imbalance. They will manifest whenever the capacity to import does not increase with real income. And he stresses particularly the fact that this wealth generated by the incorporation of technology is concentrated in the hands of local elites that have a consumption pattern that largely depends on the import. So if this wealth would be used to investments in the local economy, it could be a good result. But as they belong to the local elites that have patterns of consumption that are much higher than local patterns and that are largely dependent on imports, they normally tend to redistribute wealth towards higher classes in peripheral societies. So in general, inflation, even though it is a natural result of the development of peripheral economies, it should be avoided at all costs. How long do I have, Edward? Well, I'll just go on. So he adds that the export prices, they are very cyclical. So you have upswings and downstreams. And whenever there is a downswing in net export prices, in the international commodity prices, local elites, they pressure for devaluation of local currency because you maintain the value in local currency by devaluating local currency. So if the price decreases in dollars, but the dollar becomes more expensive in relation with local currency, you have the maintenance of the value in local currency. So you might say that local elites, they desire the devaluation of local currency. And the incorporation of technology could be something that would avoid those pressures for devaluation, as they allow for a much larger profit margin in primary exporting activities. And then we reach the last article, which has, I would say, more interesting thoughts about the specificities of peripheral economies. So he stresses again the fact that the imported techniques have capital densities that are not suitable for underdevelopment. But he also stresses the land ownership pattern in the periphery, which is something not very present on the literature that analyzes Friedrich's work. And he says that the land ownership pattern is not suitable for development at all because it's either too large or too small. When it's too large, it's welcoming for capital intensive techniques. And when it's too little, the economies of scale are not good enough to provide for a productive activity or a reasonably productive activity. And besides all that, real estate is normally used in the periphery as a tool, an asset to maintain value in inflationary environments. So, who owns land refuses to sell because it protects value over time, and as a result, you have the maintenance of the structure over time. And this is what I think the most interesting aspect of the work. He says that the ideal pattern of land occupation should be the one that allows for continuous expansion of supply with the highest labor employment and the lowest capital use, which is of course in line with the local availability of factors. And he also says, which is surprising, that the available techniques in the periphery could allow for growth with no additional land or capital use in the periphery. So he's saying that there is land that is not used well enough, even if you consider only the locally available techniques. They are misused. They're not used. I'll put it that way. They're just kept there for wealth maintenance purposes or speculation. And as a result, you have a land ownership pattern that prevents the expansion of food supply. And you have a very small local market, uh, a kind of specialization that saves labor, that employs little, not enough people, and then you have a small economy as a result, a small local economy as a result. So what are the conclusions that I reached going through those three articles? First of all, uh, I should say that Prebisch has an interpretation of inflation that is not orthodox at all. Second, he anticipates the core of what would be uh, the theory, the structuralist theory of inflation. The two main aspects reinforced by Noyola Vasquez later on 56 are both present in Prebisch's trilogy. External restrictions and insufficient investments to expand local output. Plus the considerations about land structure and food production that also appears in Noyola Vasquez. So inflation is a natural result of the growth of underdeveloped economies. Any expansion of local revenue may cause inflation as it raises demand for imports. And any expansion of the expenditures may pressure local bottlenecks. So inflation is indeed not a monetary phenomenon in Prebisch's eyes, but it might be triggered by monetary expansion. And in the end, it depends on the channels through which money reaches the economy. And this is what I would say my contributions for this conference, as the article was already published. I have already made some research on these aspects. I'm just looking for the motivation to write it. But some things that should be researched further on are the relations between wage goods and inflation. It appears in the structuralist literature in the following decades. Sears has contributions over there, Minard, and many other authors. So it appears in international uh, uh, journals such as the Oxford Economic Review, and it seems to be crucial for contemporary inflation, this aspect, the wage price spiral and the relation with the production of wage goods. Plus the competition for land between primary exporting activities and the production of food for local consumption. If you have an expansion of a primary exporting activity that competes with traditional production of food, it means that the production of food for local markets is going to be reduced, and then you have higher inflation on wage goods. And if you have higher inflation on wage goods, it's going to spread to the whole of the economy quite fast. So I would say that the structuralist perspective to analyze inflation seems to have regained relevance in present times. And the setback of the Green Revolution is the main reason for that. In the 80s and in the 90s, the structuralist theory of inflation lost a bit of its relevance because of the Green Revolution. So the supply of food products was growing really fast. But the fact is that this expansion is concentrated in few products, in a small number of food products that does not serve the local community. So you have a higher production of food, a much higher production of food, but you do not feed the workers of your economy. So, the idea that the Green Revolution would solve the problem with the inflation of wage goods is that. And the fact that the employment is reducing sharply in rural activities. So, in the 2000s, for instance, in Brazil, we believed that we could have an economy that grows because of not only, but supported by the rural activities, but the fact that is that it does not employ much. It generates dollars, so it alleviates the pressures on balance of payments, but it does not generate enough employment. And the critics to land ownership structure are, in my opinion, back in the table. And the thread that connects everything that was just said is the environmental concern. If you look closely, large-scale food production in Brazil is the main threat to the environment, and so there's a connection between the environmental agenda and the reduction of inflation in peripheral economy. Thank you.
Very good, Patrick. Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation on coverage. The floor is open. Please bring forth your questions. Yes, Stefan.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Very interesting presentation. I've really learned a lot. I don't know a lot about Prebisch, and I immediately started thinking about the countries that I know, the UK, and I think it's not just the structural theory is much more general, applicable than underdeveloped countries, I thought. So it's more of a comment that I make, not quite a question. So in the UK, for instance, when there is also at the moment trade deterioration or trade interruption due to Brexit, and due to the overall global supply crisis. So, and the global supply crisis that we experience at the moment is applicable to all countries basically. And the effect is because the currency is convertible. The pound is probably the value is will be probably devalued, and we experience inflation in the UK, and a little bit more, I think, than in the but it's also in continental Europe. And I lived for several years in New Zealand, and also what you described seems to describe the situation in New Zealand very, very well. So this focus on agriculture, for instance, milk is a huge export product. 95% of the milk that's produced in New Zealand is exported, and the fluctuations in terms of trade have a huge macroeconomic influence on the New Zealand economy. And also, so then the milk producers would like devaluation of the New Zealand dollar, so that when their receipts come in US dollars, they get more, their income is secured. Yeah? So you have exactly the same kind of reaction you can observe in New Zealand. So in New Zealand would be probably a really nice and interesting case for you. It's also relatively small, so probably easy and not so diverse as an economy. So quite a nice case study maybe for you. And also when you think about the milk, what's also happening, the exporter is Fontaine in New Zealand, and a milk a monopoly, and so the world price of milk is the local price in the country. So there's also application of Prebisch's argument that the milk is, though this huge amount of milk is produced in the country, it doesn't necessarily mean low prices for the consumers locally. That's not the case. So it's the opposite is actually the case in New Zealand as well, and that the main contribution to the climate change from New Zealand is methane from the cows out there, and less from the traffic and other productions. So a lot of arguments that you mentioned, especially in the further research, I think you could make New Zealand a really really good case for yours and or the development of your development of Prebish's arguments. So I found this really interesting, and I've learned a lot. Thank you very much.
Patrick, would like to respond to that?
Just say that it's interesting to look at the case of New Zealand, and small economies are normally good to analyze because they are simpler, they have less market. So the impacts are seen more evidently in macroeconomic terms. But the same could be said for Brazil, you know, what you said about the milk. Soybeans and meat, which are two of the main export products in Brazil, are in a fast rise and provoking a lot of trouble for containers of inflation right now.
Aurelien.
Yes, thank you for your presentation. I just wanted to come back at some point of your conclusion. You were saying that Prebisch conception of inflation was unorthodox. And I just wanted to hear you a bit more about that, just to understand what do you call unorthodox, and is it in comparison to other Latin American economists, or is it in comparison to United States economists? Because, for instance, if you're comparing to US economists, it seems to me that in the 50s, the explanations of inflation by US economists were quite diverse, and it's pretty hard to find some kind of orthodoxy. So I just wanted to hear a bit more about that.
It's precisely on the fact that inflation is not a monetary phenomenon. That's what I meant by saying that this interpretation is not orthodox. Because when you look at the orthodox interpretation, inflation is just a result of monetary manipulation.
Can I just add a follow-up question on that? Because I think that's not orthodox at all in the US in the 50s. The fact that monetary creation is the cause of inflation just began orthodox, I would say, at the end of the 70s or beginning of the 80s. So it's the same in the UK, for instance. So I was just wondering if is it in Latin America, but it was a bit mainstream in the 50s, thinking that monetary creation is the cause of inflation.
Then we have a problem in defining what is orthodox. You're calling Keynesianism orthodox. I wouldn't, but I think we agree in the end. We're just using different labels.
And if I'm not mistaken, I think Friedman and Schwartz, the book is 1956 or so. I think the research is older than when that became the mainstream, the common creed. So in that sense, you're both right, I would say.
I will ask one question, and it really relates back to the title of the paper, because it mentions ECLAC, and the particular kind of historian I am would like maybe some more details about it. What we have here is a nice treatment of the thoughts and the work of one exceptional person, and I'm wondering what might have been the contribution of the institution to the development of these exceptional ideas. Have you done work on that? Have you given much thought to that?
Yeah, those are ideas that appeared amidst the ECLAC. So I don't think they would have been spread out if it was not, thankfully, to the ECLAC. And also the context was very important for that. So you're talking about the creation of a United Nations organization. You're trying to set up international economic agreements, and you have a specific institution to deal with those problems, and one specific branch of that specific institution for Latin America. So this kind of protection, institutional bed was fundamental for the spread of those ideas. Of course, Prebisch had many of those ideas in mind before he became part of the ECLAC, and it was probably because of his works as a central banker. But I'm quite sure that the fact that he was there at the ECLAC was absolutely determinant for the development of those ideas.
Very good, very good. Well, excellent. We're moving right along now to Stefan, who is going to be, see, I think that we need to.
Does Patrick need to stop sharing so
yes,
I can?
Patrick, if you can stop share, then.
One comment on Prebisch, it wasn't Prebisch a German Jewish refugee, so he might have experienced the hyperinflation after the First World War in Germany, and that might have influenced his thinking, maybe, I guess. But that's another question. But you can come back to that in my discussion if you like, Patrick, if you have a comment on that. I have to sort of, I hope you can see the slides, because I have to keep the order on the left so that I don't lose track. Sorry. And I have the difficulty that I have to present the first part, which is my co-authors, where I'm not so familiar with the details, but I'll try to do my best to present that first, and then my own contribution to our common article. I can also say, like Patrick, it's out there. It's published in the Journal of Economic Issues, so you can find the article if you're interested in the details and the further argument. If I have to gloss over some stuff and wasn't precise enough, you can and even when questioned, do not have all the details, you can look it up if you like. Yeah, so the work came out of, how do I get to the next? Okay, here it is. So this article is a result of our common work also with, I should mention our third collaborator for quite a while was Iona Negro, and we had that. It all started with a symposium in the Journal of Institutional Economics on the institutional analysis and the gift, where we have four papers. Our own papers didn't quite make it in there, but we have lots of interesting material there that we present in that special issue and that's how the work started, and the discussion around the introduction to that special issue. Also, then we had some debates about the conception of the gift, and we also a lot of the papers that didn't make it into the special issue. There's of course scarcity of room, and so we could only publish 5 papers, but we received more than 20 or 20 something like that. And so a lot of the other papers that didn't make it into the special issue, then we published as a book, and we also wrote a nice introduction to that. So that started in the conceptual thinking. The collaboration stopped then with Iona, but Paolo and I carried on, and we wrote then this conceptual paper, and which was published as the article here in the Journal of Economic Issues. So our question is mainly, oops, what have I done now? To be careful here with. So our question is mainly to show the potential of a new research perspective, the institutional economics of the gift. The first part, we try to apply that thinking to a few subject matters, and then in the second part is the method. That will be mine. we see quite a few overlapping zones and lines of tensions there that around gift giving and how it's conceptualized and can be institutionalized and even legally enforced with and we wonder if we look at the gift, we pretty much come from an interpretation of the gift as the pure gift, as the free, as out of altruism, trying to be nice, trying to sort of like giving a beggar in the street money, or giving Christmas presents, or such so everyday practices that really and the underlying institution or behavioral institutions here as behavioral pattern would be an altruistic one. There is not necessarily there is sometimes the expectation that something comes back, or that the beggar at least says thank you or something, but that there is sort of that basic idea of that gifts can be pure, yeah, and which was discussed in the 60s already and throughout the decades among sociologists and anthropologists, but there is also the argument that economists put forward that gift exchange is nothing different from exchange or trade. And so that the main motives remain utilitarian, self-interested, maximizing kind. Yeah? So you find a lot of arguments of that. And then you find, and we'll go through that in a bit more detail in anthropology, that where reciprocity is stressed. And basically that's where we come from. That's what the institutional means, that there are at least three different theoretical perspectives or lenses that could be used to look at gift exchange and or different institutions and interpret that gift element in different organizational forms. And that's what Paolo's work is mainly focused on. I will talk about a little bit that's in the context of the modern welfare state. He's also looking at the third sector, so charities, NGOs, and so forth, and then a particular Italian tax scheme, and tries to show that it's probably useful to use all these three perspectives to get a good understanding what's actually happening there. So the question is, to what extent is the welfare state based on obligation and freedom, or just on enforced? And also all these three elements here, or these three structures like welfare state, third sector, and this tax scheme are all sort of in between the state and the market dichotomy. He's arguing that a lot in the paper. So the question is, which methodological approach, that would be my part, I send both to talk about in institutional economics of the gift. So IEG stands for institutional economics of the gift. And I will argue in the end that if you talk about motivation, of course, was probably obvious, I don't know, or that yes, you can find some quantitative data, but you have to go qualitative. You have to ask the people, you have to find out, or do participant observation, things like that, to find out what's really going on at the bottom. Is it a utilitarian motivation? Is it a reciprocity, or is it a pure gift altruist pattern that's there, or is it a mix of these three? In my own contribution as a case study to that book that I've shown at the beginning, I look at the Marshall Plan, for instance, and try to analyze this along these three perspectives. And basically I will show that there is a long history in anthropology of ethnography but that history can also be found in economics and mainly in original or old institutionalism, but also even in new institutionalism, and some mainstreamers start to pick up that mixed method and with a more emphasis on qualitative methods now for these kind of motivational questions. So let's look at the subject matter, Paolo's kind of part. So he looks at the limits of institutional economics and the anthropological studies on the gift. And so, and he says basically a lot of economic research still sticks with this idea of utilitarianism, of maximizing individual utility. And you find this in North's work, which tries to go beyond and tries to use things like path dependency and so forth, but it's still very much, when you look at work by new institutionalists, also Stefan Vogt also as an example, they stress the sanctions. Yeah? So you only get people to do something and to give something also if there's a sanction if they don't. Yeah, so it's pretty much that thinking about that's originated in utilitarianism. There's also the neglect of the obligation issue. So why should we obey the laws and norms? And that will come out when we talk about the welfare state. I'll explain it there a little bit more. So just using these, that it's all just rewards or punishment. It's all just enforced. You lose some of the explanatory power if you look at what's actually driving how, for instance, the welfare state is working. And the anthropologists, on the other hand, they overemphasize that universal obligation of reciprocity. So they are anti-utilitarian. I will come back to that point later in my part. But they stress very much this mutual obligation, kind of sort of that this social bond originates so that you feel the need to give back, and there's also social pressure to do that. And they cannot quite explain what typical modern gifts, or giving gifts to strangers, or voluntary work in charities, for instance, and in the third sector, or giving freely their money to them, and so they lose something in the explanatory power in terms of types of obligation, moral, legal obligation. What motivates the people really? And is it also, even if it's not all sanctions and enforcement, then also that kind of social obligation in terms of reciprocity is probably too short and loses some of the explanation in terms of the motivation and what keeps the welfare state, for instance, running, or what keeps the third sector running, or what's behind that Italian scheme you will see. So there is, of course, the duty in terms of taxes. People have to pay taxes that can get into prison, so it's not all voluntary. But there is also an element in tax giving which is implicitly quite voluntary. There are different, if you look at empirical studies, different attitudes towards taxes in different countries, and that depend on the transparency, for instance, of tax giving, who gives what. And so different levels of tax avoidance and tax evasion in different countries. And that shows that there is that element of a moral motivation, or a reciprocity motivation that's also behind tax payment. And also that right to take out of the welfare state is also probably can be analyzed better with this mixed explanation. So there are different norms of reciprocity in different welfare regimes, and there's some literature on that, for instance. And so that it's not all just enforced in terms of tax payments, or rights-based in terms of I just take it because it's mine, but there is different normative underpinnings for different welfare regimes, and you lose that if you don't use also the reciprocity lens and the altruism lens to look at what's actually happening in welfare states and what's driving them. In the third sector, I think that's even more obvious, because there are lots of hybrid cases of organizations with different organizational structures, legal underpinnings in different countries, and mixes of finance. So some NGOs or some charities get maybe some support by the state, some subsidies, but they also collect money from donors, and they have voluntary labors, but they also have employees that work there, and that creates tensions, and you can only understand what's happening in that sector if you use different institutional instruments to analyze how the third sector works. So you need also, the volunteers have probably lots of altruistic motivations, whereas the people who are employed, they're not necessarily, but just because they are paid, also part of why they work for an NGO and not in a private sector firm might also be the underpinning motivation, might be more altruistic or in terms of social reciprocity motives. And there is this interesting case of the tax designation institutions. So the Italian 8,000 or 5,000 thousands of your, so you have that theme in Italy where you're allowed to, where it can say 8,000 or eight of the 1,000 euros that I pay in taxes, €8 I can take that out of my general contribution to the overall tax revenue of Italy and give that instead to a particular good cause that I want to channel it, or I can say where the taxes should go. Yeah. And that's also a quite interesting, I think, mix, because people are not obviously have the obligation and are forced to pay these taxes, but then suddenly they have the freedom to divert a small proportion to where they get this degree of freedom to decide where that should go. And to analyze that, you need a different kind of approach than just say they are forced to do it. Yeah? So there is this quasi-voluntary taxation institution in Italy. But it's also interesting because most gifts in the pure sense would be a sacrifice. You give something away and it's no longer yours. And if there's no reciprocity involved, you don't get anything back. And so that's what the pure gift involves. And here you pay these taxes anyway. So it's a gift without a sacrifice in the sense that you just divert what you anyway had to give away. All right, and then now we move to the methods part. And here more the question is which methodological approaches are most suitable for an institutional economics of the gift. And I will show that between the original and the new institutional economics and anthropology and ethnography, that they all stress mixed methods with a high emphasis on qualitative, and that this is probably the most appropriate way of finding out what's really the motivation, what drives the construction of the welfare state, what drives that gift element behind the welfare state, behind the third sector, and also in these kind of voluntary tax schemes, and probably we can find many more cases of application of identifying gift giving as an element and then thinking about what's actually behind it. So of course the classical text for the gift is Marcel Mauss's book, and he has never done any ethnographic or qualitative research himself, but he screens a lot of, he goes to the archives and to the libraries, he uses a lot of examples from anthropological, ethnographic literature all over the world, and then distills his own theory, and that's where this stress on reciprocity in anthropology comes from, actually from Mauss's work. And when you look at the end of this book, he's then proposing from that, that social, he's trying to underpin a socialist society, and we need that altruist and reciprocity motivation to construct, to move away from capitalism and produce a better economic system and a fairer economic system. So it's also so the Maussians are very strong anti-utilitarians, basically. Yeah? So they would also probably criticize our work or not like it because they don't want that variability of different approaches. They then move away from, they are sort of almost similarly single-minded as the mainstream economists who always see utilitarianism and max everywhere. They see reciprocity everywhere, and then underestimate the utilitarian arguments or motivists that might be also there, and or the pure gift altruistic ones. Their method is of course inductive, historical, ethnographic, and so that's what Mauss does. And so there is a tradition in anthropology to use these methods, and to have that dualism between the state and the market, but modern anthropologists, and I will give you an example soon, they get to quite differentiated models now of variants of a state, market, or let's say the state he doesn't really we'll see take account of, but between gift giving, reciprocity, and then market relations. So we strongly, so that the second bullet point here is really important, that we, which has probably come out of my presentation so far already, that we really stress these ideal that we need several ideal types and not just one. We propose 3, yeah, to analyze institutions and gift giving. Yeah, this is Stephen Goodman's work, which I really enjoyed reading a lot. And it's an excellent example of, he's mainly using his experience in anthropological research to then propose his system of 5 spheres, where the first sphere is the house, the community relationship, which is where there is not much maximization or profit consumer satisfaction. This is quite foreign to the concept, but it's all about provisioning, gift giving, reciprocity, exchange, helping each other and so forth. The market, which is very competitive, and trading economics characterized by the profit motive. So he sees these 2 spheres, and there's a tension between these 2 and the people who move between these 2 spheres. And then he's got 3 further spheres of the market. The real economy, which is sort of the production and the selling of services and goods, and then there's a financial sphere which comes on top of it, but has very strong relation to this real economy, providing credit to. You give me a warning? Oh yeah. Oh, okay. And then there is the on top of that the more detached financial sphere. Okay, so let's go on. And he has got this colonization thesis, but it's not one way. And his method of lens analyzation is mainly using anthropological of his own field work and others. So pretty much in the tradition of Mauss. He doesn't really talk much about the state in the 3rd sector, but on the other hand, it's a really interesting way to construct theory out of qualitative mixed methods research and to use a variety of different perspectives in his analysis. So that's why it's a very good example for that. Others like Ostrom do that as well. You might be aware of that. And there's now anthropologists who turn their methods to the economy, like Zaloom's work on the traders and the pit, and Graeber's work on the debt and so forth. But that work, that economists use qualitative research and a variety of institutions, goes back to an old institutionalism. That's the 2nd bullet point here, Hodgson or Wilbur and Harrison. And to my surprise, also new institutional economics now, or to their surprise, I would say, when they see my interpretation of their work, Vogt and others, they still cling to that rigor of formal modeling. But when you look at the argument and what the evidence is very much based on case studies and on qualitative and surveys and all that kind of stuff. And also in the contributors to our special issue, for instance, some of them come from that tradition, and the evidence is very, very qualitative, but they still cling to this idea that rigor is not a participant observation, which I would think is much more rigorous, is closer to the social reality. And they try to defend that mathematical modeling as the true scientific method, basically. So I think they are not quite self-aware that they do that, but they actually they move in that direction of using these methods. And so do Schiller and Erkaloff in their recent work as well, stressing storytelling. So there is a methodological pluralism arising even on the fringes of the mainstream. If you look at the Vogt and Schiller's work, for instance, and that tradition. So it's basically one of these. And when I looked at the Journal of Economic Issues, I found basically every 10 years an article like this appears that sort of tries to say, come on, guys, we need to do more qualitative research for different kind of reasons, but and we are the ones that do that right now in the 2020s, basically fulfill that role. You can see our work like that with that application also that Paolo shows much better than I could present it here. All right, I stopped there. Thank you.
Very good, Stefan. So the floor is open for your questions. Maybe I'll start with a question. I just wanted to go back to something you mentioned at the beginning. You mentioned that you had a case study of the Marshall Plan. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering, if you can tell us a little bit about your methodological decisions. I mean, you weren't doing participant observation, so maybe you can tell us about how the methods that you adopted in this case both kind of flow from this Wilbur sort of tradition and give us something that other studies of the Marshall Plan weren't able to give us.
That moves away from what I presented here a bit, but it's okay. I've triggered that sort of. We didn't do that in our first presentation. Yes. I have to admit, I wasn't there, so I couldn't do participant observation. I've looked at the statements of people who were there. So a part of my argument to say that there was a mixed motivation behind the Marshall Plan, that it was part of it was a pure gift, part of it was utilitarian, underlying why this was done by the US, and part of it, and it led, so my argument is there, that it started from probably a utilitarian motivation in the first place. Then there was a strong element of pure gift-giving altruist that you can observe or find when you go to the historical literature, and that the reciprocity was more that followed from that. So, and what I did, so I looked at people like François Peyroux, a French economist who lived through the time and has written a book on the Marshall Plan, which is only available in French, I think. So I looked at secondary cases, and he's also got a book on gift, and so also in terms of that analysis from the 60s. And you find statements there, and you find in the work of Bataille the interpretation of that, which is based on Peyroux's work and the French philosopher. Also that kind of differentiation of different motives that he sees behind. And Kenneth Galbraith, who was there also and part of the administration, also says, yes, we had this utilitarian element in our motivation, but then there was really true gift giving and not so much the reciprocity. But my main source was actually Ben Stiles' conservative latest book on the Marshall Plan, which is all about, it was just to win the Cold War. The main motivation was just very utilitarian, realpolitik kind of argument. But the interesting, even a book by a good historian with lots of material and lots of different cases and examples, and this is full of material. If you read that against the grain, basically, so if you read that critical, I could even, someone who wants to use his book to argue very strongly that utilitarian realpolitik case, I can find elements that the Marshall Plan, for instance, has led to initiatives in the United States by the general public to make donations and so forth for Europe, for the rebuilding of Europe, and then that also that it was a grant, and that argument that it was a grant was used by the Americans to get the French not to dismantle all the industry in Germany and to insist on reparations like after the First World War, and that actually then that exchange of leaded to exchange of trade between these countries, and actually was the nucleus of the beginning of the EU was the Marshall Plan, was the Americans that got the Europeans after they've been at their throat at the Second World War to start to freely trade and exchange with each other, and not ask for, especially the French, to get the French to get that. So you've got this gift. If you want to get this gift and this grant, then you have to start to think in terms of reciprocity and not forgo your operations. So that's basically what I used. So I reinterpreted already interpretation in the historical literature. So it is quite a secondary kind of method. I didn't really, so I'm not quite following. So you can accuse me, I'm not quite following my strong emphasis on the qualitative research here. But of course, the material that I use is some stats on what was actually supplied and what was paid and by whom and so forth. An interesting element is also that the Germans in the Marshall Plan, they had to pay back. They were the only country that did not get the Marshall Plan help as a grant, but as credit, and but there was a huge propaganda. The Germans themselves, the public, doesn't know that actually. They think it was a gift because there was a huge propaganda initiative that all we got, or the Americans got us back on the feet, and so on and so forth. And of course, that was the utilitarian argument behind that motivation of winning as a front state of the Cold War. But it also initiated that gratitude and this understanding of the gift, which wasn't actually true and was secretly paid back in the 50s by the German government. Yeah, but that's that's another interesting aspect of this mixture of motives, that you need these three perspectives to truly understand what was going on. All right. Yes. Is that enough? Is that probably? I should stop here because we need to hear your presentation. So.
Well, we still have time for another quick question or a comment.
Yeah. Okay. Aurélien.
Yes.
Yes, but I have a quick question. You are criticizing two things in new institutional economics. The domination of maximizing utility framework, and second, the lack of diversity of methods. Even if you're saying that there is some progress there. And so I was just wondering, are you linking these two elements of criticism together? Do you think that one is stemming from the other? For instance, the domination of the maximizing utility framework leads to favor formal modeling, or perhaps the other way. So I was just wondering if you were linking the two to this criticism.
I think the motivation why they do it is probably backwards. So they've been trained, as we all have been in these formal modeling, and always been told, use math, use formal modeling. That's what economists do. That's rigor, and so forth. And so they invoked, especially in this article that I interpret in my article by Vogt, you find these comments that this is rigor and we need to get there. We are not there yet, but we need to get there. But what he actually does is interpreting qualitative case studies, and so so I think is this idea of rigor that's very strong, and that's an underpinning effect of being trained like a mainstream economist and thinking this is the method, and I think it's just they overlook that they're not actually doing that, and that is not very useful for what they want to, for their kind of research questions. Yeah. So I think it's they've got the wrong glasses on. That would be my argument. And Schiller and Akerlof much more, especially in the animal spirits, who are not new institutional economists, but actually really mainstreamers, they acknowledge this very much, that they have to move methodologically away. Where in narrative economics, Schiller also wants to use more epistemology, other types of models and other types of quantitative data, so that he's still harking on with that. In the book before, The Animal Spirits, he's very much stressing the storytelling. Interestingly, and what made me very angry when I read it, he's not reflecting any of the heterodox economic literature who've done it for decades and said the same thing for decades. He's completely ignoring that and reinvents the wheel, and just is scholarly. Is not very good work. I think his book. I like the message, but and I totally support it, but no, that's the problem I have. I hope that answered the question.
Okay, well, very good. Now I am going to pass the baton of being chair over to Stefan, and I will share my work with you. Give me a thumbs up if you can see that, please. Okay, good. All right, so I want to tell you a story. In 2013 lecture, Hal Varian delivered some news to the National Association of Business Economists. And the news was that computer-mediated interactions would now offer unprecedented opportunities to collect immense amounts of data. And this would allow economists, including the Google team that Varian led, to run experiments to generate more knowledge and improve online interaction. And so I provided here a quote from Varian. He says, if you really want to understand causality, you have to run experiments. And if you run experiments continuously, you can continuously improve your system. Google runs about 10,000 a year. And there are about 1,000 running at any one time. And when you access Google, you are in dozens of experiments. And so, what do you think about that? Well, since then, economists like the message. Economics professors have taken joint appointments with Google and other tech firms. Performing contract work became routine. Varian took a full-time position and others followed, and graduate students followed their mentors' examples. And so overall, they were pretty persuaded. Tech companies were too. Economists became major players in Seattle and Silicon Valley. I've given you some headlines telling us about the secret of Googlenomics, Uber's secret weapon. Amazon gets an edge with its secret squad of PhD economists. A lot of times when they'd hire academic superstars, they'd issue press releases. So, it's not much of a secret. Clearly, they're very proud, and they found their economists very useful. For their part, economists drove the creation of entirely new academic programs in data science and tech economics and design economics. They began promising to prepare graduates for employment by Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Spotify, Uber, among others. If you go to the websites for the programs, they often mention these companies by name. And in 2017, Amazon, Google, IBM, Intel, Netflix, and Zillow, in partnership with the National Association of Business Economists, began organizing a conference called Tech Economics, Economics in the Age of Algorithms, Experiments, and AI, tech for short, that's what it's called now. Soon, in short order, Microsoft, Facebook, Uber, and others joined up. And just to give you an idea of the size of what we're talking about, the last one attracted over 1,000 registrants. That was the largest conference in the NABE's 63-year history. So, it's kind of a big deal. If you went to such a conference, you would have encountered research on big data, machine learning, digitization, networks, and online marketplaces. A lot of stuff. Wasn't entirely clear what held it all together, or even why you would call it economics. What is it that, what was the coherence here? But it was clear that big tech companies liked what they saw. They set up booths and they conducted interviews at this conference. So, this website, I don't know if you're familiar with Quora, they posed a question, why do technology companies hire economists and what's their contribution? Susan Appy of Stanford University stepped forward and provided a real detailed answer, and it was widely circulated. Forbes carried it, for example. She was invited by Tech to present at a session called The Outlook for Tech Economics Careers. Soon after that, she teamed up with the chair of that session, Michael Luca. They drew upon the experiences that they had had with Microsoft, Yahoo, and Airbnb, wrote a short paper, and then finally expanded it into the version that you see before you here. Was presented. It was published in the Journal of Economic Perspectives. Many of you have probably read it. It's sort of identifies the crucial roles played by economists in the development of tech companies' business models. And also says, hey, there are more opportunities for economists to play there. So get with the times, economists. And as we've seen, economists were pretty receptive to this message. And back at Tech, it became like required reading for participants there. And so out of all this thing that we now call the tech economist was born. That's inside the profession and Silicon Valley and Seattle. What about outside? Well, the mood had turned outside. News outlets began to publish stories informing us that big tech was testing us, and how we all became lab rats for American corporations and theoretical economists. Varian's talk that we discussed earlier inspired, at least in part, the Harvard Business School professor Shoshana Zuboff to write The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. And so just want to say that outsiders were pretty clearly horrified by some of what they saw happening in this new economics. These newly christened tech economists responded by claiming that they could rein in questionable practices employed by their clients. And in fact, the experimentation touted by Varian could be used to do just that. So we find ourselves at a moment when economists eagerly shape their talents in order to market themselves to big tech firms, while at the same time reassuring a skeptical public that experimental science can harness their power for good. To critics like Zuboff, this was fantastical. She said it would be like asking a giraffe to shorten its neck. Okay. What I'm interested in is what has happened to the vocation of economics in this age of big data and big tech. Okay, so tell me if you've heard this one before. Every so often, I encounter this idea that the tech economist should be considered as a kind of data scientist. And the idea here is that a training in economics prepares the student to deal with messy data, okay? But fine, if this was all there was to it, then you might wonder what's the economics, right? What is that? What is economic theory? What's the core of economics have to do with it? In the JET paper, Affey and Luca countered this suspicion. I provided you a passage from that paper, and in it, they link tech economics to a field known as market design, and in particular, a specific program in market design, Wilson's Bayes-Nash program, which was centered at Stanford. Okay? They go on to inform us that this prepared economists, this training in the program, to study incentives, such as in the ad auctions that are central to the business plans of Google, for example. So they're stressing a measure of continuity with the core of microeconomic theory. So what can market design offer? Well, the textbook lessons have to do with truth-telling and learning. I won't go through it in detail, but truth-telling has to do with structuring incentives so participants will reveal their true private values. And the textbook exemplar of such a case would be the second price or Vickrey auction. Learning's a little different, has to do with structuring an auction to release information in order to help participants to learn about their values, learn values that they didn't know about before. And in the literature, this usually goes by the name like avoiding the winner's curse, if you've read this literature on the winner's curse. And here, the exemplar would be the English auction. That's supposed to help us avoid the winner's curse. It's a standard lesson within game theory that the English auction and the Vickrey auction share the same equilibrium outcome, but additionally, the English auction releases information over its course. And I just want to point out that if you look at what tech economists have actually done, like in ad auctions, neither of them really apply, or at least they don't apply consistently. And so I cite the passage of one survey of the work here, and it notes that it's interesting to observe that Google's promotional material touts their auction as a modification of Vickrey's sealed bid auction for a single item, which it is, and concluding, therefore, that bidding sincerely is the correct thing to do, which it is not. So what we should take away from this is that tech economists actually put aside incentive compatibility in learning, and instead they've argued for the creation of certain kinds of market devices that could be tuned in response to data harvested from their operation. Anything that could hinder that operation, from the nature of the user interface to the ordering of queries to the color of fonts would have to be accounted for. Issues pertaining to agency and incentives sort of receded. Those pertaining to the operation of algorithms, those came to the fore. Now, I addressed this point at length in my book with Phil Morawski, Knowledge We've Lost in Information. I put the picture up there. I'll just point out for now that this perspective was shared by what I call in there the experimentalist school of market design. Hey, for those of you who are in the second historicizing interventionist economic knowledge, a presentation yesterday, really good session. Jeremy Grossman described another case where strategy proofness was just sort of set aside by market designers. So this is a thing that is happening within that field. It's a common thing. What I want to convey here is that the way tech economists regarded markets were really tracking what was happening in market design in that respect. But by linking Wilson's work, that learning work, to experimentation, Athy and Luca actually end up conflating completely different understandings of what markets do. Of course, they're surely right when they link tech economics to market design, but we really need to get straight about what this link is. What I've done here is provided the roster of a for-profit company, Market Design Incorporated. I had to use the Wayback Machine to get it. Now, a lot of these principals have gone out and founded lots and lots of other companies, but this was one of the originals. It's a for-profit company, and I want you to notice the presence of several prominent tech economists here. I mean, Athy's there among many, many others. Here's where the solving of real-world problems took place. Okay, so it makes sense to ask what lessons they took from that experience in that setting with the attendant imperatives. One was that they had to get hired to participate. And this required them to promise that they could skew markets in their clients' favor. So in the most famous example, the FCC spectrum auctions in the United States, telecom's bidding and spectrum licenses hired market designers to lobby for auction forms that advanced their business interests. It was their success in doing so that led directly to the creation of this firm, among many, many other for-profit design ventures. But at the same time, that effort would have never gotten off the ground without promising that auctions could be designed to meet several public policy goals. And in the FCC case, they promised to promote a lot of them, promoting innovation, rural development, addressing discrimination, just to name a few. And so market designers claimed that they could tune markets to handle them all. Publicly, they justified their participation on the grounds that markets were more transparent than bureaucracy. The magic of market design was that it claimed to assist in the transparent pursuit of public purposes, gesturing toward Pareto optimality, but at the same time offering to skew markets in the outcomes favored by often well-heeled clients. And so we should bear this in mind, this sense of solving real-world problems when examining the vocation of the tech economist. Now, there exists evidence that this market skewing imperative lives on within tech economics. I can't go through all of the examples right now, but I'll just simply point out that it's been done very well by Salome Valohan and co-authors. I provided that up here for you. So tech economists would have been well aware of the need to address public purposes. Susan Athy tells us within her Quora piece that there have been numerous high-profile antitrust investigations against Google in every part of the world. In-house economists can directly inform regulators and also help outside economic experts learn about institutional facts, access data, and become informed. And in fact, this role has been played by lots of tech economists from the beginning. Varian, for one. Varian's original analysis of Google's auction form was presented at a 2005 Federal Trade Commission conference. And he has been at the forefront defending Google's business models against antitrust authorities. Of course, monopoly has been the only...
If you want a few minutes for questions, you should come to an end, I think.
Okay, so I'll wrap it up here soon. Monopoly wasn't the only concern that tech economists have faced. So some of you might be familiar with Facebook's infamous emotional contagion study attracting accusations of misconduct against the company, not to mention the authors of the study. And the accusations against Facebook turned darker with the Australians' publication of the contents of a secret document showing Facebook executives offering to sell advertisers access to teenagers feeling insecure and worthless. After this, there was a flood of revelations that emerged, Google's Project Nightingale, Cambridge Analytica's Facebook data scrape, and this posed a threat to tech companies who relied upon this kind of mass surveillance. Here, I just want to point out that tech economists have played a role in defending this operation of tech firms. And I provided you one who's really been the standard bearer of this position, Michael Luca. We've encountered him before. He was worried that the current mood had turned against experimentation, and he argued that with enough transparency and boundaries placed on organizations, that it would be possible to maintain the value of experiments while avoiding some of the worst abuses. He then turned the tables on Facebook's critics by asserting a moral imperative to experiment, and by saying failing to experiment raises ethical issues about ignoring evidence that could be easy to obtain. He insisted that good leaders have enough humility to admit what they don't know, identify the best options in an uncertain world, and to experiment. I'll just note that it was a curious appeal because in the same book, Luca freely acknowledged that Facebook and other tech firms concluded that prudence dictated less transparency because they didn't want the scrutiny. Okay, and as for humility, one often finds economists characterizing the engineering experimentation stance in this way, but then we're left with this sort of confusing picture. Was it acceptable to help Facebook manipulate depressed teenagers so long as they did so humbly? Okay, so I'm going to pause right here and just leave us with this, with a few questions. One question might be, when we look at the tech economists, what does this tell us about the present moment? What would it tell us about economists' humility? What would it tell us about the wish to understand causality, in Varian's words? Is it likely that the marriage of the economist and the tech platform is destined to be a happy one? That's all I have today.
Good, thank you. I open the floor. We still have sort of 3 minutes left only. That's why that's why I a bit rudely interfered. I send you that message.
Doing so.
Okay, yeah, questions, please. So if nobody else has one, can you in a nutshell tell us again sort of what the message is? Sort of, I didn't quite get that sort of what the problem of that wedding between the tech companies and the economists is that you see, that they misunderstand each other and their role, or?
Well, I think that it raises a number of tensions. Okay, so one tension has to do with this idea of transparency. Okay, so there's this idea that by allying with tech companies that we're going to learn more about the social world. okay? Sounds good, but let's bear in mind that tech companies collect, have the data, and also have a great deal of authority in determining what is being done with that data.
That's why you quoted these sort of scandals that came out, so that the economists come to that table and say it's all a great free market, free information, but actually it's more manipulation that's actually happening. Yeah, is that it?
Okay, see, that's another tension, right? Because there is this tendency to talk about this as being markets, but notice that what the market is has undergone change. Now the market becomes this sort of computational algorithmic device that can be tuned, okay? And so once you go down that road, then that opens the door for the expertise of the economist. So the economist comes in, but then can kind of tune it in certain ways. And usually because tuning it in the right way requires the expertise of the economist, then, you know, kind of transparency seems to, well, it becomes less transparent, right? So, you know, that's part of the tension is, you know, what we mean by markets has undergone change, and the attendant criterion. See, you know, before in like a Walrasian world, markets give us what we want. Now it's more like, well, we're folded into the market, into a person-machine system. And I just want to say that this isn't just the invention of the tech economist. This was the move that market designers had made, you know, really back in the 1980s.
Anyone else? Yeah, thank you for that interesting presentation. Yeah, Aurélien, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you. Yes, I would. We had a kind of similar phenomenon in the 70s, 80s with many economists hired in finance firms and becoming to work in financial markets, notably to build some models just to forecast future monetary policy, etc. And so I was just wondering if you have a comparison in mind between this particular phenomenon and what you are describing with the tech economist, and if what's the difference with the hiring of tech economists? Is it leading to some new questions, or is there something really like the economist invading the financial markets and financial firms?
I would love to answer this in detail. I know that we have to go to the next session. I'm just going to gesture toward an answer, okay? The way that I tend to view it is that this is the playing out of much larger trends within the economics profession, which I cover in some detail in the book with Phil Morawski. You know, there of course are some differences here with the tech economists, but speaking directly to the finance case, I mean, clearly a lot of what's going on there is, you know, building markets to do different things, building markets and justifying it in such a way that the markets themselves are arriving at these kind of computations that individuals themselves wouldn't be able to do. And this isn't just like an application of a theory. There's a community merging together that reconceptualizes markets in that way. And I'll stop there because I know that we're all excited to move on to the next HES session. So I thank you for your great questions and participation in ours. Great to see you, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you.